including Ireland, in any discussion of ideas of Britishness is deeply contentious, the result of the turbulent history of the Union in the 19th and 20th centuries. English kings and statesmen had for many centuries seen Ireland as a legitimate sphere of influence, a subordinate in fact to the interests of the mainland. This relationship was confirmed in the 16th century, when Ireland's status was changed from a separate lordship to a puppet kingdom, a possession of the English crown. But it was the religious Reformation in England and the attempt to export it to Ireland that was to cast a long shadow over the history of both islands. From the mid-16th to the mid-17th centuries, successive English administrations pursued a policy of settlement or plantation. English and Scottish settlers, through their exemplary model of civility and the true Protestant religion, would have, it was hoped, a transformative effect on the barbarous Catholic Irish. It was the strengthening of this religious divide between Catholics on the one hand, a group that included the so-called Old English, descendants of an earlier wave of migration, and more recent Protestant settlers on the other, that was to become the key fault line in Irish political life during the 18th century. Ever since the Reformation, a struggle for power had been waged between the Catholic and Protestant elites of Irish society. Following the victory of Williamite forces in 1691, the Protestant community determined to crush the Catholic threat once and for all. Over the next 3 decades, legislation was passed that was designed to severely curtail the civil and religious rights of Ireland's Catholic population.
Many people, not just Irish people, believe that the British government of Ireland in the 18th century was harsh, oppressive, colonial, and so forth. And in certain respects it was. The presence of a British army, of a British settler class, reinforced by the penal laws, which in the early 18th century excluded Catholics from power almost entirely, in theory at least almost outlawed the practice of the Catholic religion.
The political relationship between the two countries was one of subordination. Whilst the Declaratory Act of 1720 effectively established the right of the Westminster Parliament to legislate directly for Ireland, British politicians also sought to manage Irish affairs through a network of elite patronage.
It is possible, of course, to condemn the British rule over Ireland in the 18th century, which was certainly harsh. But I think 2 things perhaps need to be said, if not entirely to be believed. One is that, in spite of all this ferocious legislation, it was pretty patchily enforced. And in effect, and in the last analysis, the practice of the Catholic religion continued. I'm not sure if nobody was executed for their religion in Ireland, but if so, it was a very, very rare occurrence. The other thing is this: certainly in the first half of the 18th century, nothing is more significant than the relative rural peace of Ireland. Ireland isn't in flames, with risings and rebellions and so on. Ireland is no different to many European countries in having a reasonably settled, if difficult, and in many ways poverty-stricken environment. Now, in the second half of the 18th century, certainly in the last couple of decades of the 18th century, all this was to change.
During the American War of Independence, with Britain overstretched abroad, Protestant patriots were able to negotiate significant concessions and a greater degree of autonomy for their parliament. But it was to be the French Revolution that would catalyse radical opinion and provide the inspiration for the events of 1798. Those within the Protestant tradition had for a long time seen their Catholic neighbours as people enslaved by their church, people who couldn't be treated as common citizens. But the revolution in France, where the population was overthrowing the shackles of monarchy and papacy, seemed to a small but significant minority of Protestants to open up the possibility of the engagement of Catholics as citizens in a secular Irish republic. Against a background of a wider European Enlightenment that promoted ideas of religious toleration, and with an eye on Ireland's large reserve of manpower, potential recruits to the British military cause, significant concessions had already been granted to Irish Catholics in the 1780s and 90s. Although still excluded from Parliament and the top civil and military posts, these relief acts remove restrictions on religious practice, education and economic activity, and restore to Catholics the right to vote, to sit on juries, to practice law, and to hold military commissions and offices under the Crown. But by the mid-1790s, alarmed by the strength of the reaction to the concessions already granted, the government set out to reassure Protestant opinion and to damp down Catholic hopes of further gains. All the while, popular disaffection continued to grow. The demographic explosion of the second half of the century had not been accompanied by either agricultural reform or sufficient levels of economic growth. Existing tensions within Irish society had been exacerbated, and rural terrorism was on the increase as landlords sought to squeeze profit from their Irish estates. From the summer of 1795, the Republican United Irishmen, originally a movement for parliamentary reform, reorganised themselves as a clandestine organisation working for an armed insurrection with the backing of revolutionary France. They also formed an alliance with Catholic Defenders, a proletarian body inspired by a combination of Catholic sectarianism and crude but potent aspirations to social and political revolution. As armed raids and assassinations multiplied, the authorities replied with increasingly ruthless repression. And the sense of imminent crisis also encouraged an ever more open alliance between the forces of the state and those of militant Protestantism. The rebellion which finally broke out in the summer of 1798 has been described as probably the most concentrated episode of violence in Irish history. An estimated 30,000 people died in 4 separate outbreaks, one of which was inspired by the belated arrival of a small French force. In the southeast in particular, the insurrection turned into a vicious sectarian war.
I think it was clear that existing arrangements, namely the existence of an Irish Parliament and a relatively independent Irish political system, in the age of the French Revolution, in the age of Napoleon, wasn't enough. Ireland was running out of control. The existing system was no longer working. And while it might be possible after 1798 to quell the rebellion and to reassert English power, of course it could happen again. And therefore what the rebellion of 1798 taught British politicians was that for Ireland to be safe for England, and that meant not being used as a launching pad for a French invasion of England, Ireland could only be secured by integration with England, by union. And that was the legitimation, the justification for the Act of Union of 1801.
I think the political union of Ireland in 1801 was carried out at the instigation of Scots, not all Scots, but Scottish politicians who argued that union had worked for Scotland and that it would work for Ireland. In retrospect, we know that that's wrong, but at the time there was great confidence that I think reflects the confidence of the Scottish Enlightenment that education, political stability, the rule of law would mean that any people would be able to achieve modern economic benefits and cultural progress. And I think I've heard it observed that Enlightenment thinkers, and in Ireland Enlightenment thinkers were confident that the linguistic and religious divisions that were so deeply entrenched in Irish society would inevitably pass away as a consequence of Ireland, through modernisation, increasing its wealth and the level of education of its population.
The British Prime Minister William Pitt had hoped that the creation of the new United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland would be accompanied by the full emancipation of its Catholic subjects. However, George III, having sworn to uphold his coronation oath and the powers and prerogatives of the Anglican Church, refused to sign any such act if it was passed to him. In the face of this threatened veto, Pitt resigned, and so was unable to deliver on his promise of emancipation. Even in the wake of the rebellion, the Act of Union had actually been supported by the great majority of propertied Catholics, who believed that it would be swiftly followed by full admission to civil liberties. The common assumption is that following the disappointment of 1801, Catholics turned to demand the repeal of the Union and for the restoration of parliamentary independence, leaving Protestants to discover that the Union many of them had initially opposed was in fact their best defence against an increasingly well-organised and assertive Catholic majority. There can be no doubt that religion was a major reason for the failure of the British state to turn political control into political integration. But it's easy with the perspective of hindsight to conclude that the Union was necessarily doomed to failure from the start. Following the achievement of full Catholic emancipation in 1829, the leader of the mass agitation and future Republican icon, Daniel O'Connell, between 1834 and 1840, abandoned his demand for the repeal of the Act of Union in favour of alliance with the Whig Party, announcing that the people of Ireland were prepared, if treated with justice and equity, to become a kind of West Britain. Even at this point, allegiances were, it seems, still negotiable. And in fact, Irish Catholic politics were to balance uncertainly for another half-century between two alternative lines of development. On the one hand, the pursuit of self-determination. On the other, assimilation, along with Wales, Scotland, English nonconformity, and a section of the English working class, into the anti-establishment coalition that was British liberalism.